Facing challenges and overcoming setbacks is part of doing business. Whether you have the expertise to survive them or not could mean the difference between success or failure. Welcome to We Are Women, featuring revealing conversations that provide invaluable insights into the success secrets of female masterminds. A must listen for every entrepreneurial woman. Now here's your host, Janeen Vosper.
Hi, it's Janeen Vosper here, and welcome to this episode of the We Are Women podcast. Today I have Susanne Le Boutillier. I knew I was going to get that wrong again.
It's just phonetic, Le Boutillier.
So, Le Boutillier. I apologise,
yeah.
Susanne.
Fine.
No, Susanne is a leader and she is passionate about making a difference. She has a broad experience in leadership, governance, strategy and change. She's worked in the health and human services industry for most of her career, including 15 years as a senior executive. Now, during that time, she was known as someone who took on big challenges because she wanted to improve the system from the inside. And Susanne has learned at a personal and organizational level that what works, what doesn't, and how much you still need to learn. She is the founder of the T.H.E.M, T.H.E.M program, which is the Happy Executive Method, and is creating a movement of business leaders who experience personal well-being and enable it for others and deliver amazing business results. Welcome, Susanne.
Thank you, Janeen. It's lovely to be here.
I love that intro where it says enabling it for others and that experience personal well-being and enabling it for others. That's really cool. And I think there's so many leaders now that have realized that is so important with everything that they're doing.
It is. And what you see, Janeen, is people tend to do one or the other. So they're so worried about themselves, they forget about other people, or they're so worried about other people that they forget about themselves. And we need to find that sweet spot where you can do both.
And you know, it comes back to, doesn't just that simple thing when you're on a plane, if we can remember what that's like, that when they say drop the oxygen down, it's put it on yourself first and then help others, but it means you do help others as well as, but you've got to look after yourself too. Yeah.
That's right. Yeah. And by doing that, particularly when you're in a senior leadership role, you're really modeling those sorts of behaviors for the next generation of leaders so that they learn how to do that as well and how important that is. Yeah.
Yeah, it's funny. I had someone say to me this morning, we were talking about different groups, and he said, you know what the problem you've done is that you've enabled people to become leaders themselves and go out on their own. And I'm going, okay, I get that.
Yeah, but that's a sign of success. I think that's a fantastic thing to work towards, that you're actually developing the leaders of the future. And when you see someone go off and succeed as a leader, I mean, that, to me, that is just such a rich, fulfilling feeling, knowing that you've played some part in that person developing and having a positive impact on others.
Yes, and coming back to that, I know there's certain things that you hold true to you, that are your beliefs and about leadership, and so just expand on that for me, please.
Well, it's probably two key things. The first one is that I believe really strongly that leaders are very responsible for the ripples that they create in organizations. So a leader needs to think not just about, am I delivering the results that are in my performance agreement, but how am I influencing the culture in this workplace? And how you influence that culture, depending on the type of industry that you're in, either it can have a really significant impact on customers and the customer experience, or because I have a public service background, I'm also very focused on the impact that you have on the community that you serve if you're in one of those types of organizations. And leaders can either create a ripple that raises people up like a tide, or they can actually create ripples that are like being dumped in the surf and you come out with all the sand rash and it's just not a very nice experience. So what I would really love to see is many more of those really good ripples that are overwhelming the not so good ripples. So that's probably the first thing.
Yeah, and I've been in, and I'm assuming you have as well. You've had different leaders in your life in the organizations, that analogy that you gave, being washed in the sand and being thrown about. Oh my gosh, that's happened to me on more than one occasion. And
Yeah.
where I've found the main issue with that is being communication.
Mm.
That they just don't know how to get you to a level where you feel supported, but you also feel challenged, and being able to
Yeah.
do that well without just dumping you and running, basically.
Yeah. And I think it's about whether they have an ability to actually explore other perspectives, or they only are looking at things through their own lens. So I think a really effective leader is someone who's able to actually put themselves in someone else's shoes and really think of it from their perspective. And I think that's even more critical when we're talking about diversity in the workplace today, because I know I was always raised, treat others as you would like to be treated. However, I think it's so much more important to treat others the way that they would like to be treated.
Yeah. That's
And
exactly something I've had in my book I wrote 5 years ago,
yeah,
and it's something that I've believed all my life, is exactly that, because how I perceive something is not necessarily how someone else wants to be treated.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah.
Oh, we're very much agreement on that. I think that's so important. And it is. People feel good, with that golden rule that, oh, we're going to treat others well, but what is well is not necessarily
Yeah.
the same for every person. I'm reading a book at the moment written by an Australian author, Fiona Lowe, and it's all these different cultures have come to this small Victorian town, and there's African and Afghanistan women, and even teenage mothers, and all
Yeah.
these perceptions that the people in the townsfolk have towards each one of these without knowing someone's lives and how
Yeah.
things are affected. And it really is
Yeah.
very much that, isn't it? And it's the same,
Yeah.
not to that maybe that degree in the workplace, but it can be, can't it?
Well, it can in some workplaces. And when you start talking about who are their customers or the clients that they're working with, it becomes even more critical. But if we go back to communication, I think the other one that goes with that is really nicely is it's not just about intentions. You can have the best intention in the world, but if you are not actually thinking about how something is being received by the person who's listening and how they will receive it, they don't know what your intention is. So you really need to think about how they will receive this when I give this message. And the classic is when you hear leaders talking about, oh, but I was going through saying, all of these really good things, and then when you actually listen back to what they said, they would have put a phrase like, I don't trust. And as soon as the person listening hears, I don't trust, they just shut down. They don't listen to the rest of it. So it's really thinking through, how is the person listening going to receive this?
Yes, I have a lot of practice in that. I'm part of and for the last 17 years, been part of a not-for-profit public speaking organization. And I'm one of the people that they usually asked to run the evaluation trainings, or how to evaluate, or I get the job nearly every time I meet in the couple of clubs I'm in. I evaluate. That's just what I do. And it's being able to, because what a lot of people do when they evaluate is they use the words but or however. So they'll say something is working well, but, and as soon as you've done that, you've disqualified everything that you've said prior, haven't you? It doesn't matter. Nobody's heard that. It's just what they hear following,
right.
And they hear the criticism. I think human nature, we tend to look for the criticism as well. And just might be one thing amongst 20 other positives, but we'll find that one thing, because it's or some of us don't. I got a guy I play golf with, and he just doesn't on everything. It's so funny, because he's just, he just has the best game of golf every time, even though he plays really crap. But he thinks he does. It's a lovely world he lives in.
Whereas I think when you have a tendency to be self-critical, you tend to really take that to heart. The but is like a big flashing light that you just hone in on that, and you forget everything that was said beforehand. So when you're working with people and realizing that you are working with someone who tends to be very hard on themselves and self-critical, it's even more important to think about how you're actually approaching that and the quality of the conversation that you're having with them.
Yeah, and very important fact, and that is that ripple effect, because then that person, goes out in the world, and how they respond to others then is really effective. And I know, look, for me personally, I'll put my hand up. I am good at communicating outside, but when it gets back home with the hubby who I've been with for 40 plus years, you get slack. And I think that shows up in families, but it also shows up in workplaces where people have been working together for a long time.
Yes.
And it still can be heard incorrectly then, can't it?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think when you've got a high stakes meeting with a stakeholder or your boss, you're very much more conscious of what you're doing. But when you've got that close team around you that you're working with every day, you do tend to fall into habits and fall back to what is natural for you. And being aware of how that plays out is so important.
Yeah, it is. Now, I heard you speak recently on the subject of complicated and complex. And when I heard that, I thought, I've got to get Susanne on this show, because it really sparked my interest. And I love the way you gave the analogy and explained it. And, tell the listeners more about what I'm excited about.
Well, actually doing some of those talks, Janeen, made me really realize that a lot of people think that complicated and complex are the same. And so there's this phrase that we use in society, which is, it's complicated. And I think that's actually doing a disservice to people, because people think that's as bad as it gets. But and people don't really understand that complex is something different. And so I've started now to think of that as, well, complex is more than complicated. Because when something is complicated, for example, that you might have something like a plane. You can take the pilot seat out of the plane and put it back, and will the plane still work?
Yes. Well,
but
if you can't sit on it to fly, but it might be a bit uncomfortable.
But the plane will still work.
The plane will still work.
There and fly the plane.
Yes.
But if you were to take, say, the heart out of a person and just rip it out and shove it back in, would the body and the way that the person thinks still work the same?
No, because the body is a more complex.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
And so you've changed it forever. And it's like when we make mayonnaise, when we mix oil and eggs together. Once you've mixed them together, can you undo it?
No. Well,
so
you can. They separate a bit, but they always will be together. Okay.
They'll always be different. They're forever changed. So it's the interactions between things that actually affect something's state. And so what we know is when something is complicated, like a Facebook algorithm or a predictive analytics, machine learning, they're all things that can be solved. So you might need someone who's got a lot of specialist expertise, but they can have a look at it and eventually they'll solve the problem. But when you've got something complex, you can't solve it. You can actually only manage it. So some really classic examples of that are back when Donald Trump was doing Celebrity Apprentice. Would you ever have thought that he would become the president of the United States?
I don't think anyone in the world thought that would happen.
And so when you think about the impact of that on US politics, are US politics ever going to be the same?
Not likely, especially if he's thinking about coming back.
That's right. So they've been changed forever. And we look at the emergence of Airbnb and Uber and the impact that they've had on the hotel and the taxi industries. They're never going to be able to go back to what they might refer to as the good old days. And then COVID-19, when we look at how COVID, a virus that's happened in one country and it's emerged, its impact across the world, its impact on other systems. So the difficulty they have with importing building products. I know of someone that ran a music shop that's now closing their music shop because they can't get a reliable supply. because of the impact COVID has had on that.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the impact of lockdowns. These are all things that are quite unexpected. They've emerged from different changes in the system in which we operate in. And that's what we typically see with complexity. And because people confuse the two, that's why I'm now referring to it as it's more than complicated.
Yes, it certainly is. And you know, one of the first things that pops up in my mind when I first heard you speak about complicated, my husband had a 1700 Quacker motorcycle, and he traveled halfway around Australia, had a bit of an accident, and then had to get the bike and the trailer and everything shipped back. And he was determined to fix it himself. So he got about 50 little plastic baskets. He can build a house. He's a timber, but he does not do mechanics under any circumstances, do mechanics. And so he got 50 baskets. He got a manual that was about 10 centimeters thick. I'm not exaggerating. It was massive. And started at page 1 as to how to pull the motorbike apart and then put it back together. And then it still wasn't quite right. Got a friend, and what had taken him one part about 8 hours, they took about 2 hours, pulled it apart and put it back together. It was very, very complicated. But it was still a step-by-step process to something that he could finish.
Well, my husband is a master technician. So he's been working as a mechanic for many, many years. And he is one of those mechanics that can completely pull apart an engine and put every single piece back and not have anything left over.
Yeah, Don had a couple of leftover parts. Oh, okay. These are not meant to be left over. So, we'll start again.
Yeah.
But that's a step by step. It's complicated, and so for your husband it's an easier process. For mine it's more difficult, but if my husband's building a house and reading plans, that's easy for him and harder for others. So there's complicated processes. And so I suppose the learning then is, if it's complicated, if we have the desire, we can learn the steps to achieve it. But if something's complex, then there may be maybe steps to help understand it, but there may not be the steps. There may not be a solution to it.
That's right. So you're never ever going to be able to completely solve it. All you can hope to do is actually manage it. And there are some little tips and tricks about the way that you think and behave when faced with something that's more than complicated, that's complex, that will help you to, I like to describe it as navigate your way through, because it's not like you can, with a complicated situation, you know you can control it. That if you actually follow these steps or you follow this process, that you'll eventually get there and solve it. Whereas with complexity, you need to do little experiments and test out what is likely to work. You need to actually have ways of actually getting feedback. And it's about actually listening to learn and understand what's going on, instead of listening with a mindset that I've got to fix this, which is what we, a lot of the time, particularly when you're in leadership and management roles, you tend to look for, how do I fix this? Because we tend to be hardwired to do that. Whereas when you're in these sorts of complex situations, it's about listening out to understand what's going on and where might there be an opportunity to influence. So it's about actually trying something out and trying to nudge things in the direction that you'd like. It doesn't mean that you don't work out where you want to go, but instead of saying, I need to land exactly on this point, which you might do, for example, if you're putting a car back together, the aim would be, I don't want any pieces left over. Whereas in a complex situation, what you're saying is, what's the direction I want to head? And if I land somewhere in that range, I'll be okay with that. And then it's about experimenting and trying a range of different things. If something seems to be working well, it's about ramping that up and doing more of it, but always listening out for what else is going on. Is there anything changing in the environment around that I might need to slightly adapt what I'm doing? And I liken it to really zigzagging to get to where you want to be. And it's responding to what you're sensing is happening around you. And a good way of sensing is not just to look at the data, because we tend to put our own biases on things. So humans are really hardwired to filter the information that they're seeing and comparing it against what they already know and believe to be true.
Yeah.
So you make sense of things according to what makes sense to you. So it's really helpful if you can go out and get some perspectives from some different people and people who don't think the same way that you do, so that you can actually continually test your assumptions, think about how you could be wrong. Because we often have this feeling, Janeen, that you think you're just right. It feels right, so it must be right.
I'm just thinking about this with politicians. Wouldn't it be really useful if you got, I know they do, we have it with committees sometimes, but if you got one from every, from far left to far right, and you've got half a dozen of them together to devise a plan that's going to work and continue to work for 20 years in the future because it's for the betterment of all, wouldn't that be a good idea?
Well, it would be, and you could start me on another whole conversation about how the public actually has trained our politicians to respond in a way that is focused on complicated problems and doesn't actually enable us to tackle the really complex problems in our communities today. Because we want our politicians, the general public, we crucify them if they don't come out and have the answers. And we don't like it when they come out and say, look, this is a really difficult situation and I don't have all the answers and we need to try some different things and see what works. So how is a politician who comes out and says that treated in the media?
Yeah, a very, very good point about that. And particularly, COVID is a great example of that because it was unknown. It still is what's happening. But when it first sort of became public, it was unknown. Fortunately in Australia, the government quickly closed borders. And that was a great decision on that. But there was, at the beginning, everyone's going, I don't know how if we're going to catch it. You just didn't know things about it. But to come out and say, I don't know what we're doing, that's how we're going to do this, rather than trying to save themselves all the time. But as you said, it is the public that have done that because that's the expectation.
Yet we know when we're dealing with a complex problem, a thing that is a bit of a trap you can fall into is rushing to reach agreement. So when politicians are actually listening out to what are the loudest voices in our community saying and what's coming out in the polls, they then basically do what we refer to as groupthink. They appease the people who are the loudest voices. They try and make everyone happy instead of actually saying, hey, look, that's a good idea. That's one option. But before we go with that, let's have a think about what else could be going on. How else could we deal with this? And you never know, we might come up with a better option. So it's actually about, when you're dealing with these types of situations, it's getting more comfortable with being uncomfortable and recognizing that there's a difference between relationship conflict and task conflict. So if the task is to try and look at how do we deal with this problem, it's not personal. It's actually depersonalizing it and saying, look, what are all of the things that are going on here? And let's explore it. Yes, there's conflict, but it's a healthy conflict because we're testing each other's ideas, we're deepening each other's thinking, and we will hopefully come up with a better way to manage this than as if we had just gone with the first most obvious and most popular solution.
Look, I'm on a lot of boards and I really like it particularly when I'm the president of the board and I've got people that challenge me because I'm pretty much so going, okay, make a decision and act on it. Make a decision and act on it. But there'll be, and I'm thinking of a couple of boards in particular where there's people that one person comes in from a different angle on everything all the time.
Yeah.
And I've been on different boards with her over the years, and it used to frustrate, and I know it frustrates others, but in that frustration comes that, okay, this needs to be seen differently than what I was looking at it from that space. And rather than shutting it down or shutting her down, it's opening up to, okay, how is that going to work? Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't, but it's and I know she frustrates the heck out of other people who just go, she's just a troublemaker, and she's not. It's a completely different angle rather than the straightforward one. And even on a board at the moment with someone who's very, very direct, you're taking me further the other way, really direct with a conversation, and irritates people. But then again, recognizing that when she's doing things, it's because of her perfectionism, not. And it's okay. I just let it go. Yeah, fine. Fix the form up. Saves me the trouble, rather than taking offense to things. It's really interesting, and I do like it when there's a blend on boards.
And the leader plays such an important role in that space, in actually making it safe for people to speak up and share those views. And the first thing they can really say is, look, this is a situation we're faced with. I don't know what the right answer is here, but I know there's a lot of really good thinkers in this room, and let's set a time limit so it doesn't go on forever and end up being a talk fest. But let's actually go around and see what everyone thinks about this. And when you're dealing with complexity, the other thing you can do is, the old Post-it note, or get people to actually write on a Post-it note or in their notebook what they think first, so that you're not actually influencing people by what someone else has already said. And so if you actually get it all those ideas down, and I like going and getting people to stick them up on the wall, so then they can't hide it and take it away later, and then actually work through it and say, okay, well, and explore it and be curious and test and see what might relate to each other and see if it generates more thinking or more ideas, but put a time limit on it so that you then, after you've had that broader conversation, then give everyone another opportunity to go around and say how that might have made them think differently, or what they now think about a situation.
Yeah, that's a great exercise. And the point of what you started with that is saying, inviting people to contribute. And I find, because there'll always be people in the room that don't put their hand up, and you have to call on people. You can't just, because the people, I sit back a lot and watch now, but I'm sitting there going, well, I've got my answer, but because sometimes that can intimidate other people, then pulling it back and not. But in the end, I get so frustrated because nobody else has put their hand up, just someone. And because it's up to the leader to particularly identify the people who have got great ideas, but they're not the first ones to put their hand up and contribute.
And I think as a leader, it's also knowing yourself. So I know I can be very opinionated. I have a loud voice. I know when I come into a room, I can sometimes take up a lot of the space. So I learned with one of the teams I worked with, we would have a meeting every Monday morning, and they were called Stand Up. And I would not share what I thought until the very end of the meeting. So we would go through each of the managers, we'd go through each of the directors, and then I would fill in anything I thought was particularly missing. I might ask questions to understand when other people were speaking, but I tried very hard not to give my opinion, because otherwise what happens is people will just pick up and do what you say because you're the most senior person in the room. So they think that there's an expectation that they should. And it's very hard. You really got to be mindful all the time.
Absolutely. And it's also what I found, it's not just with my my husband is come home and he's walked past my window and he stands out there and pulls faces, and he's just done that. Distracted me from the conversation. Oh, good on him. What are we talking about? The other part of, yes, and I'm much the same as you. It's enabling other people to have their say, because they won't have it. I ran training yesterday, and there was 6 men in the room, and I could, from the moment it went in, I figured out who were the talkers and who were the ones that kept having ideas and opinions. So when I was asking for ideas, I was asking the 2 quietest ones to contribute first, and then the others to bring in, and which enabled. And when I didn't, they would just say, yeah, what the others have said is probably what I was thinking anyway, and it shut them down a lot. So I made sure that they had their say first each time. I didn't want to feel like I was picking on them first each time, which is another thing too you've got to be very mindful of. The post-it note thing is a great idea. I've used that for SWOT analysis also, is the post-it note, and also planning workshops. Great idea on chunking ideas and doing the post-it note. Yes, they have such a use.
They do. And even small group conversations. So even in a board meeting, taking 5 minutes out to talk to the person beside you about what you're thinking can sometimes also enable people to surface things. And although they might not be prepared to say it in front of the bigger group, the person they're speaking to might actually say, oh, actually, Janeen just raised a very interesting point. It's really made me think. So it's finding different ways to actually draw out people in the room in a way that they feel comfortable to actually share their views.
Yes, and when someone else that you've told shares your view, it doesn't feel like you've imposing ideas that's a really good way to do that.
And if you share a view, it's also saying, oh, now, Janeen, did I get that right? Is that what you actually said? So it's also checking in, and then Janeen might go, yes, but I also felt about, this other point here. So it's a way of inviting them into the conversation in a different way.
No, that makes a whole lot of sense. I gave a little bit of intro with your bio, but why is it now so important for you to be working, that you went out of the corporate and into working in your own business and working particularly with executives?
Okay, so I suppose I've always been drawn towards really challenging roles. And I've done that because working in health and human services, it was very aligned to my values and my core beliefs. And I felt like when I went to work every day, I was making a difference. So I wasn't dealing with, for example, patients face to face, but I was making changes to the system so that patients ended up with better outcomes, or children were safer because there were services available. Unfortunately, what I learned over the years is because I was so purpose-driven, and I would take on these really big, challenging roles, I would really, really, really push myself to get it done. And I had very high standards and expectations of myself. And I would have these periods where it would be really full on and difficult. I'd be really stressed, but I'd get through it. Until I got to a point where, they talk about a perfect storm where everything happens at the same time. I ended up with a period of about 18 months of, I lost resources. There was extreme stress, lots of political pressure. It was that sort of environment where you couldn't push back. And because it was also about, for example, kids in watch houses, children who needed to be cared for, and there weren't services out there, so you needed to get the services out there. So there was this very, very much heart-driven, I need to do this, I've just got to keep pushing through, and I burnt out. So after 18 months, I got to that point. And when I did that...
What were the symptoms how did you realize, what does burnout mean to you?
Well, it was pretty obvious when I was sitting in a meeting. I felt completely functional. And someone would say to me, Suzanne, why have you got tears streaming down your face? And I go, oh, it's just my body reacting. I don't know what's going on, but look, let's just keep going. We've got to get this done. And that, the work of Susan David with emotional agility just says, that is a fairly good sign that you're just too invested in the work and getting the work done. So I took some time out, and I really got back in touch with who I wanted to be as a leader, and realized that although I had some tendencies to react in a particular way, what had happened is that the circumstances that I was in really pushed every single button I had, and didn't give me that chance as a leader to actually step back and say, look, what's going on here? How do I need to adjust? What do I need to do? So I realized that I wasn't applying a workability test for my values, which is pretty sad after 30 years in that industry of being very values driven, realizing that actually it's okay to say, will my values actually work here? Mm-hmm. And if they won't, if you know that you're fighting an uphill battle and you're never, ever going to be able to win, to actually say, it's okay. Lots of people find themselves in this situation. And although you've tried your hardest, now is time to step back. You need to care for yourself and to actually be kind to yourself. And what I found myself doing is I saw my team under extreme pressure. So I was so worried about caring for them that I forgot to care for myself. And I really wasn't aware of all of those things that come in when you're growing up, you're raised in a particular way. You grow up with certain values and beliefs. And I came from a very blue collar family where my dad ran his own business, and he and my mum were very community minded, and they brought me up that when things get tough, you roll up your sleeves and you get in and you help. Mm-hmm. So when you grow up in that sort of environment, that you pick you up and then put you in a white collar environment where people have a different view of the world, and you need to actually behave in a different way. And so the reason I do what I do now is I want people to first become aware of those things that are driving them, and then how they can still keep the good things about that, but use them in a way that works for them and for their team. Because one of the things I learned is rolling up your sleeves and getting in when the going gets tough, even though it's well-intentioned, actually teaches your team not to step up, actually confuses your team about what their role is.
Disables them, doesn't it?
So by trying, it goes back to the complexity, by trying to control, there are a whole heap of perverse consequences. And so I work with people so that they can understand who they want to be, why they do the things that they do, how that might be stopping them from being that person they want to be, and then working on making those changes so that they experience well-being, the team experiences well-being, but they're still able to get great business results.
Yes. Look, that's such, what you went through. I've seen that and manifested in so many different ways. Also, it's just it's so important. We talk about values, and everyone. I do a lot of work with people with their values, and particularly around selling, because if you're going against things that you value, then it's really difficult, or figuring out how you can fit in, helping people if that's your business, rather than thinking it's a sale. There's a whole lot around that. But when I was in a GM role, there was somebody else that came into the workplace who had in a role that was an operations manager that had very different values about little things like customer service and looking after the staff and things like that, that just was so strongly ingrained in me that I really, I took just a few days off and went and saw my doctor, and I said, this is not like me to be feeling this bad. I don't get depressed. I don't feel any of that normally. And I went, you know what? I don't need to be here. Exactly the same. I really missed the money, but when you're paid well, that's a big decision maker. But and that was it. It was that value part of it. You don't treat people this way at all. And and look, no, it was only a couple of months of decision making when it eventually got really bad. But and we can't. Your health is your own. That is your priority in life. Physical, mental health is such a priority. And I think when you're in a situation, working in a situation, you don't see that necessarily, and all of that's impacted against it until there's a catalyst, and then you like yourself and myself, that you go, well, that's not going to work. But a lot of people continue to push through it don't
Yeah.
they? And with that roll up your sleeves mentality, because it's different generations as well.
Yeah.
And I'm part of the baby boomers. That's very much that this is just what you do. Don't complain, just get on with it.
Yeah. And there's lots of things that you can do. So it's not just about walking away. The first step is to actually understand what's going on inside. So what are your patterns of, and what are some of the habits that you've brought with you from other times in your life that might not be working so well for you now? And so working together on how you can change those habits. What are some of your patterns of thinking, and how is that influencing? And it's just like when we're talking about complexity, it's a very human issue. It's more than complicated. So you've got to experiment, you've got to try new things, you've got to find ways to feel safe to do that. And then you've got to practice it and lay down some new habits. So it's not always as radical as walking away or trying something different. There's lots of opportunities to reshape. And I suppose it's about understanding whether you want to move towards something or whether you're in a situation where you're playing not to lose.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's like anything. There's only three choices. You change the situation, you move away from it, you change your attitude.
Yeah.
Yeah. And depending on, fortunately I was in a financial space where I just went, well, there you go.
Yeah. And I think it starts with actually working out, who do you want to be? How do you want to be? How do you want other people to experience you? And then how do you actually find an environment that enables you to perform in an optimal way? So it might be that you can still do that where you are by making some tweaks, or having some very challenging conversations, but getting some support to actually work out how to do that. It might be that you need to move on and look for a different role, or it might be that you need to make a complete career change. But it starts with you and deciding who you want to be and how you want to be. And if you're not doing that, then you are continually playing not to lose.
Yes. And I think fortunately I can see a lot of change in workplaces. And I think COVID was a bit of a catalyst for that, where people had to look after their people, and you had more opportunity to do it, and people were working from home. So I think that was a bit of a kickstart to different styles of leadership than what we've experienced mostly in the past. And there's a lot of issues for women, particularly in the workplace. So I know we're running out of time. It's quite amazing. What do you see for women in leadership as primary problems for them?
So one of the things I've noticed is that Sheryl Sandberg's Lean In is as relevant today as when it was released. And I think for women, it still goes back to a lot of women don't have confidence in themselves, and they doubt whether they are enough and whether they have all of the skills in a role. I know when I was coming up through my career, I would be gobsmacked I wouldn't even dream of applying for a job unless I knew I could kill it, that I would just, do it really, really well. And then there would be men in the workplace who I knew didn't have the same skill set as I did, yet they would be just confidently apply for opportunities. So I think it's women, we still really need to work on those. We need to think about how we fall back into some of those roles where we're the ones that organize all the social activities or organize the catering and clean up afterwards, and the things that end up going against us. And even when you're doing that in a junior role, when you're in a more senior role, what I noticed is a lot of doing all of the work behind the scenes to make sure something ran really, really well, but the person who was at the front was a male leader. So you ended up being the female leader behind the man, making the man look good, and you wouldn't sleep at night, and he was.
I've seen that so often. That is just so true. And I think it's that possibly that innate nurturing that's in in females that
Yes.
brings that, but it doesn't, it goes against us in the workplace when that's happening. Yeah.
It does.
Yeah.
And I think one way of countering that is showing that women can be just as good at strategy. Women can be just as good at managing the bottom line. It's not all about soft skills, but doing that in a way where you can be yourself, but with more skill. So people talk a lot about, you don't have to be like the men in the workplace. And it is really uncomfortable and awkward sometimes. I mean, I find it really challenging. You don't want to be really blokey. And there is a lot of that culture, particularly in Australian workplaces, more so than in other countries, where you just know that you're not quite connecting with some of the men at work.
Yes, and it is, that's that fine balance. And I'm just thinking about, again, this training yesterday, it's knowing that you are a female, and there's a different language that's possible, and if there's an odd slip of the word, it's not then necessarily intentional, so it's not something for the female to get upset about, or men in the room that might get upset about it. But it's also recognizing that when the males apologized for it, it's not, you just get that nice balance where there's respect. I think that's the word. It's respecting everybody's capability and capacity to contribute. I think that's where it comes down, and that it's hard with political correctness. I know I've got some work coming up in a space where there's different ideas about what that means, and it's going to be a very interesting conversation. It'll challenge me, which is great. I love learning from different generations, have that different expectation, I think. A lot as well.
I think unconscious bias is something that is really challenging to deal with, and it's easy enough to say, oh, maybe when you notice it, you should ask the question, well, I noticed that you treat me differently to this person when this happens. But it's easy to say that. It's much harder to actually do it when you're worried about the consequences of calling it out.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good point. Also, I know my a lot of the men in my life work in construction. A lot more women are coming into construction, and my oldest son, runs major multi-million-dollar jobs, and he said it's just being mindful that there's women on site. You just have to be. It's the way it is that there's, and some. And it just fits in with whether people accept it. But again, if it's, people, I'm talking back to swearing, if people, some men don't like swearing. I know when I play golf, there's a gentleman that's in his 70s and he hates it, absolutely hates it. So it's not just a women thing. Anyway, I've gone off track here. But
it goes back to what you were saying about we were talking about communication, and it's about thinking about the person who's going to hear it, how they're going to receive it. And it doesn't matter whether you're male or female, if we treat people as true individuals, with different backgrounds, cultures, all sorts of things, I think we then start to unpack that, because it's not just about, as you say, about women. It's actually about how we treat people.
Absolutely. Now, the takeaway points, we've come to the end.
Okay. So I suppose one thing that I would suggest that people ask themselves is the situation more than complicated? And if it's more than complicated, do I need to perhaps think differently? So do I need to focus on how do I manage it rather than trying to control and solve it? I love the saying that you talked about at the beginning, which is making sure you put your oxygen mask on first. And the other thing, I think we probably didn't talk about it too much, but recognizing when good enough is okay and that not everything needs to be perfect. I think is one of the ones, like, imperfect action is actually okay in a whole host of situations, and it's being selective about when does it need to be just right.
Yes, I was going to, which you were talking about you having to be in control and everything. I was going to bring up the term perfectionist, and if that was part of the issues around that. But yes, I that's one that. What does perfect look like? You can't. There's nothing that says something is perfect, and it's all to do with a perspective on it. So I'm very much good enough. that works. You try and do your best with everything, and if it's and I tell you what, I think that's what builds confidence also, rather than going, you know what, I've done my best. It's I just have to be happy with that, because I can't do anything that's better than what I've done. And if I want more skills in something, well, then I'll go and learn something.
And look, if we tie it back to complicated and complex, when it's complicated, yes, you do need to try and get all the screws back in where they need to belong. Otherwise, things might start falling off the car when you're driving down the road.
Yep.
But when it's complex, it's good enough. Just give it a go. Do a bit of an experiment. See what you can influence. See what happens. And if it works, do more of it. So, different ways of thinking about it.
Absolutely. Susanne, how does everyone get in touch with you?
So you can find me on my website at susanneleboutillier.com.au. You can also find me on Facebook, LinkedIn and Instagram, and just search for my name.
And I'll spell that out so everyone has got that, but it'll also be in the show notes. It's SUSANNELEBOUTILLIER. Very good. And particularly, leaders who are looking for that, being able to not get to burnout, not, be able to be in a position and be able to work in something that they love doing with them and with themselves and with other people, and to be able to lead and build other leaders, I suppose is what you particularly help do, isn't it? It
is. And I think it starts with knowing who you want to be first, and then prioritize working on you. But if we go back to put your oxygen mask on first, if you're not working on you and focusing on you, that's when things start to go off track.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and I say this every single episode. The time goes so fast. We
doesn't it?
keep chatting. It's been wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you for having me, Janeen.
You're most welcome. And that's another episode of the We Are Women podcast. I really thank you for listening and joining and subscribing to the podcast. You can also find me and leave a 5-star review if you've really enjoyed this conversation as well. You can find me at janeenvosper.com. If you're not sure about, your business, how it's growing, just want some clarity on ideas, if you want some help on how to express yourself, how to communicate well, even help pitching a business, whatever it is, I'd love you to jump onto janeenvosper.com and just book in a free strategy call. We can have a conversation, and I'll see if I can help you or give you some ideas and techniques. And if not, I will be able to direct you to people like Susanne or any of the other wonderful ladies that I've had on the podcast. You have a fantastic time now. We'll look forward to you joining me on the next episode of the We Are Women podcast. Bye for now.
So, do you feel stuck in a rut in business? Visit speechperfect.com.au and download Janeen's free ebook to avoid the 5 most common stumbling blocks women face in business. It's jam-packed full of tips to overcome the barriers that could be holding you back from the success that you dream your business will be. We would love you to leave a review of today's episode and share this podcast with other women in need of entrepreneurial inspiration. Subscribe to the next episode now and join the We Are Women community.